Good evening again, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Isabel Molina, and I am the public programs producer here at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's book talk for Women of War, the Italian assassins, spies, and couriers who fought the Nazis. Here at the museum, we are dedicated to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti Semitism, stories of resistance against injustice, and more. Thank you again for joining us today virtually. We hope that if you're able to, you'll visit the museum in person to see our current and upcoming exhibitions and for our upcoming programs, including our fourth annual New York Jewish Book Festival, which is coming up this Sunday, November 16th. Closed captions are available on today's program, and instructions on how to turn those on or off are posted in the chat. If you have questions for our speakers during the program, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the hour. Again, that's the Zoom Q&A box and not the chat. Now, today we are honored to be joined by Suzanne Cope and Olivia Campbell. Suzanne Cope is a scholar and narrative journalist and is the author of Women of War, the Italian assassins, spies, and couriers who fought the Nazis, and Power Hungry, Women of the Black Panther Party, and Freedom Summer and Their Fight to Feed a Movement. Her work on themes of political and social change, feminism, food, and culture has appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, Los Angeles Review of Books, Food and Wine, BBC, Washington Post, and others. She's a professor at New York University. Olivia Campbell is the New York Times bestselling author of Women in White Coats, How the First Women Doctors Changed the World of Medicine, and Sisters in Science, How Four Women Physicists Escaped Nazi Germany and Made Scientific History. She's also a thesis advisor for Johns Hopkins University's Science Writing Program and a regular contributor to National Geographic. Her work has appeared in The Atlantic, History.com, Scientific American, The Guardian, Literary Hub, and New York Magazine, among others. Thank you all again for joining us, and now I'm going to hand things over to Suzanne and Olivia.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi, Suzanne. So to start off, could you give us a little brief overview of your book? And you wanted to do a short reading.
Sure. So I love because I'm going to keep the reading a little bit shorter because we're on Zoom and to have a lot of time to be in conversation with you, Olivia. I'm going to read a brief chapter from maybe about a third of the way through the book, and then I'm going to go back and put this into context for us historically. But briefly, what folks might want to know is that this is a narrative of the anti-fascist resistance told through four women who were part of the resistance, and they're from four different cities. We have Carla Caponi, who was in Rome. We have Teresa Mattei, who was in Firenze. Anita Malavasi from Reggio Emilia, which is near Bologna. And then we have Bianca Guidetti Serra, who is from Turin. And so I'm going to read a little bit about what Carla Caponi was doing in March of 1944. This book mostly is focused on pretty much summer of 1943, which is when Italy, they deposed Mussolini, and it took them 45 days to officially surrender to the Allies. And that was when the resistance started to foment. And then as soon as they surrendered officially in the beginning of September, the Germans had occupied all of Italy, or most of Italy, pretty much north of around Salerno, where the Allied soldiers had landed to make their way up the boot. and they were under, torturous martial law. And that was when the resistance really became instrumental in fighting the Nazis while they were supporting the Allies, but also to rid their country of fascism. And so the scene I'm going to tell you happens about 6 months later in March of 1944. And Carla Capone in Rome has joined the underground guerrilla warfare group called, abbreviated, the Gapisti. And she is, well, you'll see, she's taking part in her own women-centric protest. I forgot I'm of the reader's age now. So this happened in Rome on March 3rd, 1944. In the cool of the late winter morning, Carla was outside a prison in a large group of mostly women, including the wives, mothers, and children of the seventh and most recent Nazi roundup of men who had been pulled off the streets and jailed ahead of their departure to Germany. They were taken from a neighborhood at the edge of St. Peter's Square, in sight of the Vatican, where the Pope resided, resulting in another 700 men likely bound for forced labor in Germany. The family members were here to get information, donate food or clothing, and pass messages. A number of other women, Carla and fellow Gapista Rosa included, had come to show solidarity in a protest organized by the women of the Gapisti. While the workers' strikes raged in cities across the north, here there were few large factories, so the resistance focused on supporting local issues, like the persistent abduction of Roman men. Carla had come armed with her Beretta, as well as anti-fascist leaflets addressed to the women in Rome. When she was safe amid the crowded center of the throng of women, Carla tossed the leaflets into the air, many women around her stuffing them into their pockets or bags to read later. The Nazi and fascist guardsmen saw this explosion of paper and tried to infiltrate the crowds to discover its source. This effort was stalled when the group of women began chanting, "Teresa, Teresa," as they parted to allow a very pregnant woman to make her way towards the front to deliver a package to one of the many men at the barred windows. The crowd grew silent as Teresa Gulace, with one of her 5 young children following close behind, broke into a run through an opening in the police barricade, her son holding on to the hem of her dress. She threw her parcel of food towards the windows, her husband and his fellow prisoners leaning down to try to catch it, but it fell short. She grabbed the package to try again when a German officer on a motorcycle pulled up. Carla was near the front of the crowd, watching the scene from a few yards away. The women around her started shouting again, this time at the officer, demanding he leave Teresa alone. The crowd surged towards the barricade, leaning on Carla, and she had trouble catching her breath as she watched the interaction play out in front of her, her hands clasped around the gun in her pocket. Carla watched the German grab Teresa, but the words they exchanged were lost in the cries of the crowd. Teresa freed herself, and the officer grabbed her again, nearly lifting her off the ground. Teresa's little boy bent to pick up the package, and Carla heard an explosion. The Nazi had drawn his gun and shot the woman dead. The crowd began to wail, and Carla, incensed and with no thoughts as to the repercussions, pulled her gun from her pocket and pointed it at the German. She was grabbed by fascist guardsmen who tried to disarm her, while women from the crowd attempted to pull her free. Rosa squeezed close to Carla and whispered, "Give me the gun." As the women pulled Carla in one direction and the guards in another, she was able to release the weapon into Rosa's waiting hand as she was tossed about in the roiling ocean of furious, grieving women. Carla was finally pulled from the crowd by the guards and forced to walk towards where Teresa's murder had taken place, past the small wailing child who still clutched the clothes of his dead mother. One guard kicked Carla to make her walk faster. "Let's kill her here," the guard said to the other. "No," he responded, "at the barracks." Um, So this is a moment where you see and hear, what was happening in Rome, but of course, similar things were happening around the country under German law. Ostensibly, we have Mussolini, who was in charge. They had freed him from where he was held captive at the top of this mountain, and but he was really a figurehead, and so the Germans are now in charge. And the resistance is pushed far underground, knowing that there is, horrific punishments, quite likely just immediate death if anyone were to cross them. And partnering with the Nazis, who are now, in control of most of Italy, we have the fascists those who had stayed loyal to Mussolini, and they, kind of decided to, throw their hat in with the Nazis. So they were eating better. They were, keeping their jobs. They had a much better existence under the Germans during this time. And then you have those who were in the resistance who were anti-fascist. They wanted, after the war, they had hoped to win, and they wanted to create their own government. So we have, at the same time, we have the partisan army, which was a group of men who had gone into hiding, and then many of these women who were helping them, because it was much safer for women to be moving around in the cities and in the countryside. They could bring food, they could bring messages, they could bring guns. So it was really up to the women to be these couriers, the staffetta, as it was known in Italy. And then you have also those who were kind of in trying to create this new government. And what they did, actually, to very much to their credit and to their success of the post-war government that they came together, there were 5 parties that had kind of quietly stayed together during Mussolini's 20 plus rule. And leaders from those 5 parties knew that they had to work together to create a united coalition, both during this time of resistance from summer of 1943 until the end of the war in 1945. And also so they could prove to the Allies that they could govern themselves afterwards. So they were, pretty much in charge of the resistance in a lot of ways, although it was very difficult to get, the messages were transported for the most part through women couriers, and that they were organizing themselves to be in charge after the war.
It wasn't just that the men were doing partisan activities and that was the danger. It was they were essentially dodging the draft, and that's why they would be suspected. So that was really interesting to me. It wasn't even about their activities. It was about them just existing in a town and not being off fighting in the war.
Exactly. And as this protest was showing too, is that in some places the Germans, they were so desperate for people to work for them that they were stealing men off the streets. You could a man who, wasn't, maybe was too old for the draft, but he was still walking around the streets, he was going to work, and he could be abducted off the streets, and his family wouldn't even know what happened to him. And his family could never find out. And then they were sent basically as slave labor to Germany.
So it's always interesting to me, the choosing of the subjects. So how did you pinpoint these 4 women, and do you have a favorite? Because I always have a favorite. Is that
Uh,
just me, or is it you too?
I mean, well, I do have favorites for different reasons. So I spent a summer doing just a lot of research, knowing that I wanted to focus on this topic, and seeing what was out there, and seeing what who these women might be, because of course I wanted to focus on the women of the resistance. And I had a long list of names, and I decided on these 4 for a number of reasons. They were from 4 different places around the country, and so I was able to tell this larger story through these 4 different, well, 3 of them are cities, but and then, well, they're all cities, but some of the women were moving outside of the cities as well. And Anita Malavasi in Emilia Romagna, she ended up in the mountains. They were also doing different roles. While they were all couriers, which was pretty much how most women initially became part of the resistance, they also had other roles. We have Bianca in Turin, where she was an organizer in the it was a big manufacturing city, and so she was an organizer in these factories, in the Fiat factory and others. And she also was very instrumental in writing a lot of underground newspapers and publishing them and getting them out there, which was the main way to counteract the propaganda of the state newspaper. You have Carla, as we just heard, was part of this underground guerrilla warfare group. And so what they were doing in Rome, a lot of that was, putting bombs on Nazi trucks, and they were, trying to sabotage whether it was anti-aircraft guns or blowing up fuel sources, and also assassinate people. And they really wanted, because Rome was supposed to be an open city, which meant it was not part of war. And that meant there was supposed to be no acts of war happening in that city. But certainly the Nazis were not adhering to that at all, and they were terrorizing the people of Rome. And so what the Geppisti wanted to do was make it as uncomfortable and scary as possible to be in Rome for if you were a Nazi. And so that was very much their goal, in addition to just helping the overall war. And then you have Teresa Mattei, who was in Florence, and she was from this anti-fascist family. The other three their families were anti-fascist, but kind of subtly so, because it was very dangerous to be explicitly anti-fascist, and you wouldn't want, as you're bringing your kids up, you wouldn't want them, telling their friends how their parents felt. The parents could end up in jail, or heavily surveilled, or lose their jobs. And so, but Teresa Mattei's family was very explicitly anti-fascist. She was brought up with the Olivetis and the Roselli brothers coming to her house as part of this intellectual, discussions happening. So they were all surveilled. Her father would be sometimes arrested if Mussolini was coming to town, just as a preemptive measure. And so they were allowed to be openly anti-fascist to a point. And so it was interesting to get her perspective. So she was very much trusted by these leaders of this new government, of the resistance, because of her family connections and because she had been involved in this anti-fascist fight prior to this time of the war. And so she would be sent out. She did a little bit of what these other women did. She did, she participated in some bombings. She did write some underground newspapers, but she also was very trusted to deliver the most important messages. And then we have Anita Melavasi, who was she was initially a courier, and she was often going from the small city of Emilia-Romagna, which is about an hour outside of Bologna. And she would be going to these small towns outside of the city. And in one direction, it was the Apennine Mountains. So often going into the mountains to deliver things, guns, food, salt, other supplies to the partisan bands, the groups of men in the mountains. And then she was suspected of being a partisan. And she knew she had to escape. And so she escaped to the mountains, and she became part of the partisan band, one of the first women to do so. And so she fought alongside these men, and also did, a version of what she was doing in the city. She would be the outrider, where she, was less suspected. So she'd go out ahead with all the men hiding behind her, and she would scope to make sure that it was safe if they were going on an action to blow up a bridge or something like that. And so she was the first one out there, definitely in the most dangerous situation. So we have these four women doing different things in different places, and their stories really help tell this broader story of the resistance and of what women were doing. But as I know Olivia, it's also about what they leave behind. So I could tell so many amazing stories. I could write this book multiple times with a bunch of women doing similar things. But these four women really left behind these long testimonies. Anita Melavasi left behind hours of written and verbal testimonies and video testimonies. Two of the women wrote memoirs. So the reason that I was able to have such a detailed scene, every detail is accurate to a source, but it's because Carla wrote about her experiences. She wrote about being in that in that very moment, and how she felt and what was happening and what she could or couldn't see or hear. And so I was able to use their own stories and use their own words to help this come alive, and then juxtapose that with for example, Carla's partner in the Get PC, he wrote memoirs afterwards as well. And so he wasn't in this particular scene, but he was in other scenes with her. And so he would tell his version of the story. She would tell hers. They were generally almost the same, but whenever there were subtle differences, nothing, very consequential, but I always preferenced her telling of the story above his. And so the fact that they left behind these robust archives of their voices also really helped me tell the story in the way that I wanted to tell it, which was as novelistic as possible and as dramatic as possible.
I was constantly impressed by the bravery of these women. They run towards the danger, and just like in the scene that you read, like they didn't, didn't care about themselves. They were only for the movement. And I was, people would be injured. They would be running toward the bombing, the noises. They just wanted to help in any way they could. That was just so impressive.
It is
So
amazing. And
it's,
they're so young too. I mean,
yeah,
I should have mentioned that a little sooner, but they're all in their early 20s. And it's just, yeah, it's just astounding to me. And they spent pretty much their entire lives that they could remember under Mussolini. And so they were very, except for Teresa, whose family taught her a little bit more of the outside world, but they were ill-informed in a lot of ways, and they were just going with their gut. This is what they felt was right. And they were learning kind of during the resistance, they were really learning about this larger political reality that they were fighting for.
Now, I'm always fascinated by instances of sexism in history, um, where people sort of turn that on its head and use it to their advantage, right? So there we have women being really underestimated here as potential political operatives, right? They were not suspected. They didn't think women were really interested in politics or would care. So how did the resistance use this to their great advantage?
Exactly. Well, you and I, we look for the same stories, which is why it's perfect we're in conversation. That also is what struck me about these women and what drew me to them is that in all the ways that they were assumed to be, oh, that women aren't political, women aren't smart, women aren't brave. And this is exactly what they were doing. And so they were able to hide in plain sight because the fascists and the Nazis, thought so little of them. And for our viewers, our listeners, the fascists really were, they kind of invented the concept of, well, they didn't invent it, it was a long time, but of the trad wife, right? Of encouraging women not to, prior to Mussolini taking over, women were starting to feel pretty emancipated in Italy. And they were, trying to get a better educated, taking part in all sorts of arts and, having striving for different jobs. And then he said, no, we don't want any of this. We want women to go back and just birth babies for the regime. He would say things like women should be wearing long dresses, long sleeves. And so this is really, how the fascists thought of women. And they thought of them as, they should be in the home, they should keep quiet, they should submit to their husbands. And so the fact that they really believed this meant that these women, as they walked around with guns and bombs in their bag and illicit in newspapers, that they weren't really generally searched. And it wasn't until relatively late during this occupation time that probably until Carlo takes part in the biggest bombing against Nazis in occupied land by civilians a few weeks after the moment that I read. And that was the first time because they knew that there were women that were part of this. They knew her specifically. And so she became hunted. But that was the moment that a memo goes out across occupied Italy saying, that these bandits, the partisans could be women or men, and you need to watch out for them. So that was really the first time they acknowledged very openly that women were part of this resistance, because before then, women could walk up to, there would be roadblocks all the time and all over the place. And there's this one story which is interesting in multiple books that I've read, and seems to be something people remember, and I even reference it in my book because it's such a great story. A woman who I don't name, and I'm forgetting who it was. Even it was someone that wasn't really part of my story more broadly, but she famously walks up to a roadblock and they say, "What's in the bag?" And she said, "Bombs." And they're like, "Ha ha ha," and everyone laughs, and then they let her walk through. And she had bombs in her bag, but I mean, you could tell the truth, and they still wouldn't believe you. Which I guess brings me to the question that I didn't answer of yours yet, which is if I have a favorite. And I mean, I love Carla's stories in Rome, and I mean, doing this research in Rome was so much, so much fun because I got to walk around and literally walk in her steps because Rome has been the same, right, for millennia. But I really love Anita Malavasi. She's just super sassy, and she was also, it probably has something to do with maybe the fact that I had the most oral testimony from her, and also her testimony that I used was the only testimony uh, that wasn't formed into a book or a part of a public conversation or an interview. So it was very personal, and she was very sassy. And she would tell the story, speaking of going up to these roadblocks, where she would start to flirt the guys at the roadblocks a little bit, and she apparently was pretty well endowed because she talks about hiding guns in her cleavage. And she tells this other great story where she'd walk up or she'd ride her bike close by. Just she might have guns strapped to her or something like contraband she didn't want them to find. And so she'd kind of like pretend to pull her skirt down a little bit and then give them some winks, and then they'd whistle. And she wrote, they whistled and let me pass, stupid fools. And I just love her. And she also has some really great, sad as well, personal drama that happens. She had this horrific, and I tell this story in the book. She had this, pretty awful fiance that she had met on, when she was quite young, and then he went off to war, and so they didn't spend a lot of time together. And then he returns from war, kind of soon before this resistance happens, and she realizes they just grew apart. He wasn't someone that she wanted to be with, but she felt like she had no choice. And so this was part of her political awakening, is thinking, um, wow, do I really have agency? Can I really do something that my dad and my fiance don't approve of? And for her and so many other women, this was a moment where they felt that they truly, were in charge of themselves for the first time. And if curfew would end up being so early and they'd be out on these missions, and this was the first time they weren't home, that they were going around and maybe consorting with men without family members around, and truly fighting for something they believed in. And more than one woman, both of the ones that I, write about, but also of the many other women that I researched and read about more broadly, said that this was the time they felt most free, even though they were being hunted basically. But Anita ends up breaking up with this fiance, and I love her for that. And she really seeks out a different life that's really true to who she is.
So we touched on this a little bit. Your book is filled with so many vivid, highly detailed scenes. It's just very impressive to me as a fellow history writer that you could do this. Like, it's always gold when you find these detailed scenes you can create. Can you talk a little bit about your research process and all the work that goes into crafting those scenes? And also, is all of this in Italian? Do you speak Italian?
Oh goodness. So I am Italian American, and I've studied Italian off and on for more than 20 years, and my grandmother spoke it, but she didn't teach it to us growing up. But I really came back to I learned a lot of Italian, or honed my Italian for this research process. And as soon as I wanted to get serious about this project, which was about a year before the writing really started to happen, then I really ramped up my Italian studies. And so I could read well now. But I think as your brains age, I realize that the reading and the speaking and the listening are three very distinct skills. And so I can read pretty well, but I wish I can converse okay, but I keep trying to strive to be better at that. But I did improve because I was able to spend really 4 total trips to Italy. One was a number of years ago when I first became interested in this story, and that resulted in actually an article for the BBC many years ago. And then a minor genesis of this book is that it was going to be a smaller story within within a book that was telling different stories of women, exactly these kinds of women throughout history. And I ended up pivoting on that book and turning it into my last book, Power Hungry. And when that book was researched almost entirely during the pandemic. Luckily, I got a little bit of travel in right before the pandemic. And so when I was thinking about my next book, I thought, I really want to travel. And where do I want to go? I want to go to Italy. And so I went to Italy 3 more times in doing research. And one of those times it was through NYU has a Florence campus. And so I got a fellowship through them. I spent a summer based out of Florence, thanks to NYU, and they give you research help. And so while I was there, I took a bunch of trips to the different places that these women lived. And the great thing about Italian archives is that there's many of them. They're very, honoring of the past. And there's a lot of smaller archives. I think in the United States, we we generally have archives that are attached to universities or attached to government entities, but there's a lot of private archives that are very specific. And so they would have almost every region, or at least every region that I was really researching in depth, had their own archives that were about the resistance, and they were very dedicated to that. And so they may not be as well organized at times, because I generally just spoke to the archive librarians and said, this is what I'm looking for, and they'd plop things in front of me. And so it drove my publishers a little crazy, because they're like, where is the citation? I'm like, this is the best I can do. They were not in a box with a label. Like, it was at this place. And so I include a note in the book that says, I will gladly connect anyone who wants to recreate this research, and I will connect them to my sources in Italy. And so you open up these folders and you just don't know what's going to be inside. And it was really, very magical. You could go through 20 folders and not really find anything pertinent to my research, even though it might be fascinating. And then you can open up a folder and think, this is the exact piece of paper that I know Bianca held in her hand. So there was Turin has a great, robust archives, and so I found a lot of documentation of what Bianca wrote, and she helped organize these strikes that were the largest strikes in Nazi-occupied territory. 20 up by some accounts, up to 20% of the occupied population went on strike. Actually, I alluded to that in the section I read. I said, while other places in Italy were on strike, and that this was this giant strike that really changed the course of the resistance, because so many people joined this giant general strike, and they felt that they were part of something bigger, and they became more dedicated to the resistance afterwards. And the Nazis and fascists realized how many people were fighting against them, and became a lot more scared and capitulated a lot more. So this strike was very effective. But yeah, Bianca was one of the people who helped organize that. And they would hand out these little slips of paper to tell people when the strike was going to happen. And so some of these were in the folder. I also really tried to recreate my final trip, which was a lot shorter after this long. I had pretty much finished the manuscript, and I was filling in some last details a couple months before it was due. And my goal was, in addition to asking a few key questions, and one was wanting to find out, there was a love of Anita's life, and she didn't name his first and last name, and so I wanted to see if I could find out who he was, just to give him a little bit more of a name, of an identity in the book. And so I searched everything I could think of online, and then I go to the archive librarian there, and I told him everything I knew, and he goes boop boop boop, and he gives me a name from his database using the information I had. And so it was so wonderful to be able to name him fully in the book based on that. But I also walked in their footsteps as much as I could. And I'd spent, of course, a lot of time in Florence. And so I saw what Teresa had seen and what she had talked about. But Anita, so when I said she had to escape to the mountains, the Apennine Mountains, the partisans had, they didn't create these paths, but they started using these paths that were probably, ancient paths going between towns up and down the mountains. And this was the people who lived in these towns probably played on them when they were young. And so they knew these paths like the back of their hand. And this was the way that they got safely to all these different, villages and partisan groups. And they're now just I would say not, maybe in the last 10, 20 years or so, they turned them into hiking paths, and they put a lot of monuments in the mountains. And so I was only able to hike a small part of it, but it was a part that I knew that she had, walked on many times. And so even though I was only there for a very brief, few steps, maybe more than that, but a pretty short hike, I was able to feel like I could see what she saw and hear what she saw, hear what she heard. And it was really very moving. And I really look forward to spending more time doing that. And I did the same thing in Rome, of course. I really wanted to go back and follow this exact path, not of Carla actually, but one of her comrades who was caught after this major bombing that I just mentioned, and he was able to escape and run to safety and warn the others. Otherwise, Carlos certainly would have been captured. And so I wanted to trace that path of his escape, and it was like a, putting together a puzzle from the few details that she had in her memoir, and then I was able to walk that path and describe what I saw. So yeah, my research took a lot of different paths to all to try to make these scenes as robust as possible.
I love that tactile connection that you can make with the subjects, and I think that really shines through in the book, that how connected you feel and how thoroughly you researched and physically, went to these places. That's amazing.
Thank you.
Um, so the experience of the Holocaust in Italy isn't as well known as many other places in Europe. Can you talk a little bit about the experience of Jewish people in Italy during this time and how the women of the resistance were involved in that?
Sure. So, Italy, I mean, Italians now they say, "Oh, Mussolini wasn't that bad," because, they point to the Holocaust that he wasn't, you know, he wasn't being as cruel as Hitler was. And of course, that's, he instituted all of these racial laws modeled after Hitler's in the late 1930s. This was something that Teresa Mattei was she her mother was Jewish. Her grandmother had escaped a pogrom, and so she very much, took issue with these racial laws, even though she was not, in the eyes of the Italian government, considered Italian or considered Jewish. And she also, in my book, I mentioned that she stood up and left school and was basically expelled after a protest where they were trying. Her science teacher was trying to say that there was a biological basis in race that was supporting these racial laws, and so she was, very openly against these racial laws and against all of the Jewish people in Italy who were being taken out of their jobs and being fired from the universities. And once Mussolini was deposed, that was one of her actions in the group that she was with. That was one of the things that they wanted to do first, was to try to rectify this. Of course, they didn't know that they would be occupied 45 days later. And then that was when, Germany, the Germans brought their deportations and started to root out Jewish people in Italy and start to deport them. Luckily, many people in Italy started to sound the alarm. Many rabbis and also some clergy members, some Catholic clergy members, and so there's a statistic of around 80% of people who Jewish people who went into hiding around the start of the occupation in early September 1943 would make it through the war alive. But of course, they were these horrific Nazis and fascists were always on the hunt. And so I do, to help illustrate what this was like, I do tell the story of Primo Levi, who was very good friends with Bianca in Turin, and he considered himself both a partisan. He joined the partisan army, and this was his way of protest. And so when he was captured, along with two others of their friends, he actually hid his gun that he had, and they hid any paperwork that they had. His two friends, Luciana Nissim and Vanda Maestro, because they didn't want to appear to be partisans, because they were afraid that they would have been killed in that moment, which is very possible, because this was, in fall of 1943, and they would, if they found someone they suspected of being a partisan. This was where the partisan bands were very new. They would often just kill them on the spot. But instead, they admitted to being Jewish, and they were deported first to Fossili, and that was a concentration camp in Italy. And then from there, that they would send them to other camps outside of Italy. And so, these women were very, part of what they did was try to help hide people who were Jewish. And in fact, Bianca's boyfriend who would become her husband after the war. He was Jewish, and he was part of a band in the Alps. And so there were a lot of men who were in hiding, but also they're like, I'm not just going to hide. I'm going to become partisans as well. I'm going to be fighting for this future that I want. So it was a different experience in Italy, but of course, it's not as if it was easy. But once the Germans were in charge, then what was happening in Italy was very much treated like they were in all their other occupied areas.
Okay, final question here as we're ending our time. What do you want readers to take away from Women of War?
There's a time not too many months ago where I was thinking, what do I do? You see, felt like there was so many issues that I felt like I wanted to be a part of, and I have spent many years of my life now researching people who were fighting for revolution, who were, as you note, like how they were so brave and they were so willing to put their life on the line, from as soon as they saw these injustices. And I just felt paralyzed. And I was like, why am I paralyzed? Why do I not know what to do after doing all this research? And I thought, okay, self, go back to what these women did. They didn't walk into a movement fully formed. They didn't try to do everything. They just started small. They started learning. Political education was such an important part of being in the resistance. There are all of these classes. There was this women's group, abbreviated, very long name, but abbreviated the GDD. And that was one of the core things that they did, was just teach women, political education and what are these possibilities beyond what was taught in the fascist imposed curriculum in schools. And so, I looked to them and I thought, all right, political education is important. And that's something that I really strive to do, not just with my books, but also writing a lot of articles that might be more digestible or more people might find. Starting small, just thinking, what can I do in my community? What is one action I could do to connect to community? I think of the first thing Anita Malavasi did is she was out and she saw someone, one of her brother's friends who she had actually helped to escape the fascist army. And so she just thought he was in hiding. And, she did do this one thing. And he said, oh, if you could just bring me salt. And so that was the very first thing she did as a courier. She just brought a group of young men salt, and it grew into something more and more. And so I think about all of the ways that these women and men and the other people who are part of the partisans, they created this movement step by step, person to person. And the other thing is that we tend to, want to valorize those who are on the front line. And there's a statistic at the end in my epilogue that says that there were 15 people supporting every single person who was an armed partisan. And so without those 15 people, these armed partisans could not have done anything. They would have just been sitting ducks in the mountains or in a basement. And so that's so important to remember, that the support staff, the support people that may seems like I'm not doing anything, I'm just, these women, I was just knitting some socks. That's actually so important. And I think a lot of people maybe think that what they're doing isn't enough, and so maybe they don't do anything because they think it's such a small gesture. But these small things all add up and are essential to this larger fight, whatever your specific fight might be. And I think there's a statistic I heard much later after the end of my book, which was that even when we think about, and maybe the exact statistic, I should have written it down. There's so many stories written about World War II, and I know we write about a similar era, focusing on the stories that are lesser told. But of the stories that are more likely told is usually the men in battle, right? Well, it's such a relatively small percentage of those of military people during the war who were actually fighting. I mean, it was something like maybe 15%. I might have that slightly wrong, but not that wrong. Like the vast majority of the people in armed forces were in support staff. And so, to think about that more broadly, this is called, in my book, there's a term of Italian scholarship called le maternage, mothering. So, and this ties directly with a term, the activist mothering from my last book. And it was something that was like such a perfect through line between these two books, even though they're different in a lot of ways, is that this, um, the resistance through these feminized acts, feeding people, clothing people, making sure they're safe, was really such an important, essential part of any kind of resistance and movement.
Thank you so much. That was fabulous.
So thank you for your
I
direct
loved
question.
hearing all about it.
Well, thank you both so much for such an incredible conversation. Um, we're going to move on to the audience Q&A portion of this evening. We've gotten a couple questions already, but by all means, if you're in the audience and feel inspired while we're speaking, feel free to submit a question. I'll also combine a couple if they're similar in an attempt to try to get to all of the questions before we end tonight. So starting off sort of more broadly, Suzanne, we got a question about what the reaction to your book has been like. And I'm not sure if there is an Italian version out yet, but this one audience member is asking if there is an Italian version out, if you've noticed a difference in how US and Italian audiences have received the book.
I think it is criminal that there has not been an Italian version yet, but I know my publisher's working on it. I'll have to ask Olivia for pointers because her book is well received in Italy. But I only know the reaction from the folks who I have shared the English version with, and those were mostly people I'd already been working with on my research. And so they have asked the same question, when will there be the Italian version? But I have a lot of folks that I've met during different events. A lot of people were just like, finally, this is a story either of their parents or of their grandparents, whether they are Italian or whether they have some other connection to the war. Like there were some people, people who are American whose father or grandfather were in Italy as part of the Allied soldiers, and had stories of how the locals helped them, or maybe they got separated from their troops or something and they were treated so well, and to them this is finally a story that helps that come alive a little bit more, like what those people were like and what it might have been like on the ground. um, I mean, really, this book could be written 10 times over with different women and different locations telling different stories. I feel like I barely scratched the surface because so much of what is written about the war, they keep kind of going over the same stories from different angles. And this story has been completely ignored in writing in English. There hasn't even been that much in Italian written about it, particularly the women. There's been a great book that came out actually in the middle of my research by Benedetta Tobaggi, and that's really the only popular book, other than a scholarly book that covers the same time period. So I hope I'm able to share it with folks who in Italy who speak Italian.
Well, thank you. And that the last part of your answer actually bridges perfectly into the next question, which is one of our US audience members wrote in saying, these stories are basically like unknown to them before this evening. So they're wondering why you think these stories aren't more well known. And they also asked about the legacy of, these Italian resistance members in Italy, if maybe, Italian audiences know a little bit more about this history, or if you sort of alluded to they're also unknown in Italy as well.
So in Italy, yes, these stories, particularly of the men, are very well known. And they have days. They're what their equivalent of the 4th of July basically is the day, not the end of World War II, but about a week or so before, which was when the partisans helped to push the Nazis out of Italy. And so yes, these partisans are very much valorized, which is interesting in that their politics has turned rightward at various points in time in the past 80 years. But the stories of the women are less well known. So of these four women, two of them were actually in politics. Anita Malavasi was probably the least well known. She was more of a local organizer, and then Bianca was a public advocate and a lawyer, mostly in Turin. So she was relatively well known. But the other two women were in the government. They were elected officials. And in fact, Teresa Mete was the youngest person and one of the only women who helped write the Constitution after the war. And so they are, about as well known as maybe like a senator or a congressperson might be, and to the average person. So especially if they were doing something, maybe children of the time, if they were in the news at the time, then the people might know them. And now, because I ask a lot of folks who, I had a student who actually did, he's mentioned in the source notes, because he did not translations, he did transcriptions for me. So some of the audios I had, because I was saying that my listening skills are not as not as good as my reading skills, I had him transcribe it, the audio into Italian so that I could read it and understand it better. And his grandparents were actually partisans, and so he was knew this larger history and was connected to it, but he didn't really know the names of these particular women. And early-ish in my research, I went to an archive, for a resistance archive in Florence, and they were said, "Oh, Tuscany just came out with a document." And so this is, in the 2020s, just came out with a document that is starting to honor the women of the resistance. And so this is a continual fight for their publicity, to really share this history of what these women were doing, even though some stories are better known in some areas, because Italy is very provincial and regional in that way.
So the reason
Well,
we don't know these stories is because they're women. Like that's the answer. The only reason we don't know them before now is because they were women. I had a question that made me think of, did you connect with any living relatives or ancestors of these women?
So two of the women did not have any living children. And then Teresa Mate, who was perhaps the most polarizing figure, in small part because of a story in the book, but also just because of her political life afterwards. I tried to connect with, I believe she only has one living son, and he is very explicitly like, not talking to anyone, living in Prague. But late in the process, I did connect with Bianca's son, only child, and it was so late that I really just kind of ran stories by him. I'm like, fact checking in a way and saying, "Is there anything else I can add?" And he was so lovely, and he said, "You're telling me stories that I didn't know about my mom." And not to give away a tiny spoiler, but she does marry, I think I mentioned it already, but she marries her boyfriend during the war, who was a partisan, and they get married and they have this child. And he said that yeah, that his parents didn't really talk about it. And I heard this from other people and other researchers who have also talked to other children of people in the various resistance movements, that the parents just didn't. Yeah, it was kind of it was something, maybe so moving or so difficult, that they didn't really tell these stories to their children. But there was a story or two that he had heard, and there was one that I was not worried about, but I was happy that I had another layer of kind of fact checking, because the fact check, she wrote about this story of when she was almost, Bianca, when she was almost caught, like past curfew, and she ends up in seeking refuge in what she knew to be a friendly hotel, and this is up in the Alps. And I was actually able to go to the same town, just to kind of have a sense of what it was like for her in this moment. And the woman, the proprietor, she welcomes her in and gives her some soup, and she's just like, "Oh, of course you can spend the night here." And then there's a knock on the door, and all these boots are outside, and it's a fascist army, and like a battalion, and they're like, "Let us in, we need a place to stay." And so she clearly had just arrived. Why is she out there by herself? Women aren't supposed to be traveling by themselves. And so the inn woman at the inn, she hands her a smock and says, "Okay, you work here. Pretend you work here. Just get them drunk and I'll prepare all their rooms and you'll be safe." And so she's doing that and she's not doing it very well. And she says in her memoir, I should be wearing glasses, but I never wanted to. And so I couldn't read the labels on the bottle. And then one of these officers recognizes her from law school because she has a law degree. It's like, "Why are you here?" And then he goes, of course, "Oh, are you a fascist? Are you a partisan's girlfriend?" Like like he thinks he's busted her and he can't even imagine that she was a partisan, that she was, actually has her own agency, and she almost got in trouble for just being a girlfriend, like bringing, visiting her boyfriend. And but she convinces him otherwise, and ends up getting home safely. But yeah, that was a story that she had written about and briefly, and then I saw this plaque that also tells a similar story, but they had some different details to it. So I was able to ask Fabrizio, her son, if he knew anything else about this story, and so he confirmed that the version I had in the book was accurate to his understanding, which I appreciated. But I was really happy to be able to tell him more about his parents' lives that he had never heard.
Well, thank you so much for sharing what a great story. And Olivia, it's like you're a mind reader. That was the next audience question I was going to ask.
Sorry.
No, it's perfect. We have another audience question about Italy. Suzanne, you mentioned you took some trips there to do research and study. And one viewer wrote in that if they were looking to make a trip to Italy to learn more about, its specific World War II and Holocaust history, would you have any suggestions of where they should go or where they should start?
There's some interesting smaller museums. There's this, it's called a Museo Diffuso, in Turin. And Turin is like an I know you just recently went there, Olivia. It's kind of like an under the radar city, and it's very
Mhm.
beautiful and
That's my
super
favorite.
accessible. It's right next to the Alps. I mean, I took a couple hour trip from there. I drove to the Alps and then came and did some research and came back. Um, and there's this great museum called Museo del Fuso that it takes you, it's like a walking tour around parts of the city that tells you, I mean, I reference it in my book, and there's some moments, including this woman, Ada Gobetti, that you go to her house. And there's another kind of underground museum too that's part of this, where you feel like you're this is my description of being in a bomb shelter, was because they recreate it for you in an old bomb shelter. And so I was actually there with the recreated bombs and the shaking even, and they have that. So that is a really, I think that would be a great city to visit. Um, then if you go, of course, Rome has, different places that you can visit. It's a difficult but very moving museum. At Via Tasso, it was a police barracks, and then it was a Nazi, it was basically where they tortured people. But it was it was very interesting, and not, like you could do it in an hour or so, and it was very moving. And they also have a history of the occupation, at the same, within, while it's also telling the history of this story of this building. So those would be two kind of lesser known museums. And also the Ardeatine Caves, which I've been alluding to this major bombing action that Carla Capone took part in. And it was the Via Rosella attacks. And after that, the Nazi retribution was horrific. They took over 300 Romans, and they killed them, and then buried them in this cave. And there's a very moving museum, and it's just on the outskirts of Rome. I took a bus from the center of Rome very easily, and that would also tells the story of the occupation, and other aspects in Rome and elsewhere, and in a relatively small space that also is kind of accessible in a couple hours. So, and there's also very beautiful synagogues. The synagogue in Florence has an interesting history and would be great to visit as well. Um, yeah, so those are some spots, and most of them are mentioned at least in passing or in my source notes in the book.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for all of those great recommendations. I know we're just at the hour, so I think that will have to be our last question. I think I got to most of them, but apologies to anyone if I didn't get to your question. And just to end, I'd like to thank, of course, Olivia and Suzanne for such a great presentation and conversation this evening. And of course, thank you to our lovely audience for joining us. If you enjoyed today's program, we also hope you'll consider making a donation to support the museum, which you can do at mjhnyc.org/support. And we hope to see you for our upcoming programs, which you can find at mjhnyc.org/current events. So again, thank you all so much for joining us. Have a great evening, and we hope to see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. I appreciate
Thanks.
it.